Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 218. This week the questions are taken from guide 260 to the never-built key-class battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Wednesday video on the development of ironclads from 1867 to 1872. So let's begin. Fickle Finger of Fate asks, France's Marine Nationale has a long history including some rather odd capital ship design philosophy. However, there doesn't seem to be very much written about the French Navy's contribution to actual combat operations in World War I or World War II. Did the French Navy, for all the resources placed into it, actually do anything during the wars? The Second World War is a bit of a patchwork, so obviously their main naval effort rather came to a screaming halt with the fall of France, quite early in the war, but before France was forced to give in to the Germans, the Marine Nationale was actually getting up to a number of different things. They were doing shore bombardment along the Channel coast in an attempt to shore up the Allied armies as the Germans were pushing them back. They had the Forsterade, or Forsterade, I can't remember exactly how that's pronounced in French, but anyway, they were assisting with the hunt for German surface raiders, so Admiral Graf Spee, the surface raider, Deutschland class, potentially could have run into one of the Dunkerques, which that would have been a rather short battle. They were also helping in the Mediterranean, although the Italians weren't involved in a good chunk of the early part where France was also involved. The Italians only really joined the war just as France was about to bow out, but they are helping to secure the Med. And there's the occasional French ship up in the North Sea helping out with things like the Norwegian campaign, some convoy escorts and so forth. So they're actually doing a fair bit all told, especially considering that they don't yet have Richelieu in commission, so they don't actually have any sort of modern full-scale battleships. The closest thing they have is Strasbourg at the start of the war. Then you have, obviously after the fall of France, you have the Vichy French Navy and the Free French Navy. So the Free French Navy obviously is active working with the Allied navies, and they gradually acquire more and more ships as time goes on. The Vichy French Navy mostly just patrols and tries to maintain what's left of Vichy France's territorial integrity, with occasional skirmishes with the Allies for various reasons, mostly when the Allies are moving in to either try and persuade French colonial possessions to side with them and join the Free French, or when they're just flat out invading them, like Madagascar, Dakar, Syria, etc. And in the First World War, the French Navy was also doing a fair bit of important duty. Now, granted, they weren't staring off against the High Seas Fleet waiting to do grand battle in the North Sea, but the Marine Nationale was present helping to escort troop convoys and supply convoys back and forth in the English Channel, although that was primarily a Royal Navy duty. But one of the single biggest things they were doing was effectively running a good chunk of the Mediterranean. Now, the reason this was very important was because during most of the 19th century, the Mediterranean fleet was the key Royal Navy posting. All the latest ships went there, the majority of the Royal Navy's battle line went there. It was kind of the key heart of everything. That began to change very rapidly with the rise of the German Navy, but the strategic considerations of the Mediterranean hadn't gone away. They were still entirely there, and so the Marine Nationale took over most of the duties that the Royal Navy had previously been doing in the Mediterranean to keep it secure and contained, which was hugely important. They were also escorting troop and supply convoys from French North Africa. They were helping the British and later the Italians bottle up the Austro-Hungarian forces in the Adriatic, and there was a significant French contribution to the Gallipoli campaign as well, plus various overseas colonial escort and protection missions. French ships, for example, fell victim to Emden during its cruise in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So although there weren't all that many glorious, battleship on battleship actions or major fleet actions involving the Marine Nationale in either war, they did play a very important part in World War One in enabling the British to have the numerical superiority that they did in the North Sea without compromising their strategic outlook elsewhere. And in World War Two, they were shaping up to be a very key and important part of the Allied war effort until, as I said, the fall of Vichy France, or the fall of France and turn into Vichy France. And that's why when you see in some of the early parts of the war, certainly around the invasion of Norway and the areas plus and minus of that, when the Royal Navy suspects a German capital ship might be out, they suddenly start surging 4, 5, 6 capital ships, multiple cruiser squadrons, and enough destroyer flotillas to shake a stick at, in answer to what they think might be Scharnhorst. And then fast forward to 1941 and Bismarck breaking out, and suddenly it's a aging battle cruiser and a brand new, just commissioned battleship. That is kind of the difference between having the French on side and not having the French on side. Basically, in World War II, everything that the French Navy was going to cover, the Royal Navy suddenly has to scramble to cover instead, on top of all this stuff they were planning to cover anyway. Plus, to be fair, by that point, Italy has joined the war as well, so there's a significant diversion of resources into the Mediterranean, which, if France was still in play, and by that point probably would have had Richelieu up and running, there wouldn't have had to have been anywhere near as large a commitment from the Royal Navy to the Med. Ralph asks, did navies ever consider or use shrapnel and fragmentation shells for defence against torpedo boats? Yes, they did, and in fact they were the primary anti-torpedo boat armament, or at least shell loadout, for the secondary and tertiary battery armament of pre-dreadnoughts and cruisers and so forth, and even some early dreadnoughts, at least at first. Now, let me explain. That's not what we might think of as a shrapnel or fragmentation shell, i.e. a shell that you fire and it has a fuse and it goes off somewhere down the line and, several miles away. What they had was actually an upgraded version of, an upgraded version of something that harked back all the way to the age of sail, canister shot. It's literally called canister. And yeah, when you look at the plans for the canister shells they were using in the 1890s, 1900s, they very much are the immediate antecedents of the shrapnel shells that you might find being flung around the battlefields of World War One. They did have a certain amount of delay, but it wasn't a huge amount. They were basically the next best thing to turning secondary and tertiary guns into big shotguns. Now, with all that said, why did they stop using it? Basically, the problem was with the technology of the time, the guns using canister were fairly short range. You didn't have, some kind of long-term time fuse that you could use over 5, 6, 7 miles. You certainly couldn't dial in that fuse accurately enough at the time, given that the secondary batteries certainly didn't have full fire control in that period, so it would all be done by eye anyway. And, proximity fuses are something of the Second World War, not the late 19th century. So you'd basically have, if you were lucky, a short fuse that would ensure that the shell cleared the gun and maybe made it out a little bit, and then it would go off, and then there'd be a big spray of shrapnel and fragments. The problem with that was it was very short range, as I said. So as long as torpedo boats were needing to get fairly close, which was, of course, largely dictated by the speed and the range of the torpedoes at the time, then these shells could be quite effective. You could blanket an incoming torpedo boat with canister. They're not especially large. They're in no way, shape or form particularly durable, and neither are the men exposed on the decks. So the torpedo launchers themselves are on the decks as well. So yeah, you can basically cripple an early torpedo boat with a blanket of canister shot, or at least so the theory went. But as soon as destroyers started getting larger, and torpedo boats turned into destroyers, larger, faster, possibly slightly better built in some cases, but mainly the torpedoes got faster and longer ranged, which meant that now destroyers could engage you from outside the effective range of canister shells. Then you had to go over to using full-sized normal shells. And of course, with the destroyers being bigger and somewhat stronger, more strongly built, you also needed to start thinking about penetrating deep into the destroyer's depths in order to stop it cold, rather than trying to sweep the decks at close range. Alec Keeler asks, I wonder why you did civil rather than a nautical-based engineering degree. Well, I've covered this in a few previous videos, including the more recent one where I ate unreasonably hot and spicy chicken, but never mind. So anyway, the answer is basically, in a rare moment of financial clarity for a teenager, I asked the various courses that I was interested in when they had the University Open Days what the relative ratio of people who study and qualify with this degree was to people who actually got a job in that industry associated with that degree. And for my primary choices, history, maritime, aeronautical and astrophysical engineering, the answers were single-digit percentages, and usually quite low single-digit percentages. One degree course basically said 2 to 3% of graduates will actually get a job in the field that they study. And so I was working down my list of preferences. Civil was fourth or fifth on my list. And then they say, oh no, about 85-90% of people who get a decent degree in civil engineering get a job in civil engineering. And I was like, great. I guess that's what I'm going for then. This question answered for you by the horrific and frankly terrifying image of baby Drach receiving his degree. Captain Seafort asks, I've recently been reading McLaughlin's Russian and Soviet battleships. The description of the issues the Russian Navy suffered due to the shallowness of the water around St. Petersburg until the construction of the St. Petersburg to Kronstadt Sea Canal leads to my question. How exactly does one build a sea canal? Is it simply a matter of dredging out a deep water channel, or is there more to it than that? So there is obviously ongoing maintenance, but surprisingly enough, for such an important shipping channel, the St. Petersburg-Kronstadt Canal has surprisingly little written about it. There's a lot of period literature and even some encyclopedia entries under the heading of canal from the period, various engineering journal discussions, but whilst they all stress, yes, this is very important, and yes, this is going to allow Kronstadt to become a purely naval base, and St. Petersburg is going to be opened up to trade, and all of this, and even gives you the exact course and direction of it, how long it is, how wide it is, how deep it is. When it comes to the construction elements, most of them just say, well, it's been constructed. And you sit there going, that's not helpful, because constructing something like the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Manchester Ship Canal, the Kiel Canal, etc., that is a very different matter to constructing a canal through a harbour, because there's already the water there. Although eventually I did manage to track down a slightly more detailed explanation that calls it actually the Kronstadt Passage and says this is often called the canal, and does go into some detail about the fact that yes, in fact, it is a dredged canal. Now, of course, if you're going to dredge your way across a harbour seafloor, then you are not just going to be doing regular dredging. I mean, they did dredging to widen the passage into Portsmouth, for example, in order to let the Queen Elizabeth class carriers in more recently. But when you're dredging, you're also going to come across shipwrecks, rocks, protrusions, etc. So as well as dredging to form a sea canal, or what these days will probably be called a shipping channel, you also have to have divers and explosives on hand in order to clear out any rougher bits that you might not want there. And then it's also a case of making it not just big enough to fit the ships, but making it overly large, because of course if you're dredging through silt or sand, then the chances are that there's a reason that silt or sand is there, thanks to the actions of rivers and tides and sea currents, which means it will inevitably start to silt up again, or sand up again, or basically fill itself in. So you make it slightly overly large, then you have your safe passage down the middle, and then you will then have to do continuous maintenance in order to keep it running and keep it open. But when you have these kind of major commercial deep water channels, they very often lead into more regular, if you like, works closer to land, either more traditionally built canals or harbours where there's a bit more physical infrastructure like foundations and sidewalls and so forth, which you generally aren't going to be building, 30 plus foot down in the middle of a harbour in the middle of the 19th century. Kenneth Carl asks, what was the contemporary name for pre-dreadnought ships? Obviously they weren't called pre-dreadnoughts at the time. For the most part they were just called battleships, and then you see the reference to a dreadnought type battleship coming in after obviously dreadnought is launched. Classifying everything into dreadnoughts and pre-dreadnoughts kind of is hashed out in the latter part of the 1900s, but there are also a couple of slightly odd to our modern ears, at least, holdover terms. So you'll recall from War of the Worlds, which is published in the 1890s, set right at the end of the 19th century, Thunderchild is still called an ironclad, even though ironclad hasn't been a even close to correct term for the armour that ships are using for over 2 decades at that point, when you look at the earliest introduction of compound armour. But the term still exists as a recognisable one in popular culture, much the same way as you'll see some elements of the media today refer to almost any naval warship as a battleship, albeit that at least the ironclad designation in the late 19th century had some element of historical holdover, i.e. it was the correct designation for the kind of ship that was being addressed at the time, even if it was 10, 15, 20 years out of date. They were still the same kind of ship, the battleship, the capital ship, as opposed to these days where everything from a destroyer to a frigate to a patrol boat to a rigid inflatable speedboat is sometimes called a battleship by some people. And of course that's in English. In other languages they have other names which don't directly translate from battleship. So in German, Linienschiff, i.e. line ship or ship of the line, actually persists quite a long time into the age of steam and steel, and you have various other similar terms in French. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it in French, but a lot of the ships are still called some variant on the word cuirasse, which is armour, or breastplate actually. It goes all the way back to, if you know your medieval periods, cuirasse, theoretically, according to some entomologists, actually goes all the way back to cuir, i.e. cuir, which is a reference to boiled leather, which in theory is supposed to be the origins of a breastplate, but by the sort of 14th century, cuirasse means breastplate, the metal breastplate of a knight, which also leads to the term cuirassier, which is later on armoured cavalry generally, but in the 14th century is also a reference to the knight as well as cuirasse's breastplate. And if I'm going to give it a stab, I think it's cuirasse, which would be a term for battleship in French. Certainly a number of books that I have in French on French warships, French battleships, call them cuirasse de 19,000 tons. I'm not even going to try and pronounce 19,000 tons in French, but anyway. So, yeah, which is kind of, I guess it's calling them armoured ships, which would be similar to German Panzerschiff, but obviously implies battleship, even though it's using a derivative word, which goes all the way back to, as I said, knights on horseback. Actually, 19,000 tons, wouldn't that be 19,000, if I'm remembering my high school French correctly? Peter Wright asks, would you consider doing a video specifically on the design considerations of Hood? It seems on the face of the stats that Hood had the same main battery as the Queen Elizabeth's, but to gain 8 knots they added 220 foot, several thousand tons, and took a little bit of armour off. It definitely is something I could do in the future, and unlike some ships, the design changes and controversies that surrounded Hood from conception through to execution actually pretty much could fill a full Wednesday video, because, as I've said before, the shorthand version is that the spec for Hood was Queen Elizabeth protection, Queen Elizabeth main battery, but fast. And then there's a whole load of shenanigans that go between that and the final result that you actually get, which, weirdly enough, actually pretty much does fulfill those requirements, even though they tried practically every design variant in between during the design and initial build process, and of course revisions post-Jutland. So yeah, that's something to chalk up for the future list of videos to do. Ben Arnold asks, to what extent was the limiting factor of battle ranges the precision of ranging as opposed to the precision of aiming devices, i.e. coordinating multiple guns over different arcs of fire? It was almost entirely the issue of being able to work out the range. The ability to fire multiple guns as a broadside electrically had been around for a couple of decades at the point that people started seriously looking into range. In fact, some of the earliest experiments went back even further than that, but for the bulk of the second half of the 19th century, you can say that the ability to electrically fire simultaneous broadside had been present when we talk about the ironclad period. Now, coordinating multiple guns to all aim at the same point, again, this, by the time that you got turreted and casement mounted guns, was not hugely difficult. Obviously, when you're talking about guns on individual carriages, then you're relying on individual aiming of individual gun crews, which is somewhat harder. But once you've got something that is either a turret on a rotating platform or a casement, which generally will tend to have some kind of guidance rail to help you slew the gun around, then you can relatively easily point your guns all in the same direction, because you just put, degrees, minute, and even minute marks on the various turntables and guidance rails, and then you just say, okay, everyone, we're aiming, let's say, 10 degrees forward of pointing guns directly to port. Obviously, they'd express it slightly differently, but you get the idea. And everyone goes, oh, okay, well, that means we put the gun this way, and as long as all your markings are accurate, then the guns are all pointing in the right direction. So that wasn't a problem. The problem was pretty much, as you said, the range. Working out the range was incredibly difficult without rangefinders and other mechanical aids that came in right at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th centuries, purely because as you've probably seen from various videos where I've either talked specifically about rangefinders or I've looked at rangefinders in passing, it all comes down to triangulation via binocular vision, and human eyeballs are only a certain distance apart, so we can only really realistically estimate ranges up to maybe 800 to 1500 yards, if you're particularly skilled. Beyond that, you need some kind of either mechanical assistance, or you need to know in advance what the range is, which of course at sea you won't, because you don't have familiar landmarks and so forth. So when you look at rangefinders, they are basically spread out the 2 points of vision, which allows you to triangulate at ranges considerably further than what the human eye and human brain can do on their own. Of course, that then just allows you to fire the guns at roughly a range beyond which you'd normally be able to figure. You've then got to incorporate technologies to stabilize the guns to keep them actually aimed on that point, or delay firing coils in order to ensure that the guns only fire when the ship's at an even keel, if you don't have auto stabilization available. And then you have to start working out the fire control procedures, because of course if you're firing at 1,000 yards with a relatively high velocity late 19th century gun, you don't have to lead your target all that much, whereas if you're firing at a target that's 5-10 miles away, you do have to lead your target a fair bit and start taking into account your own ship's motion as well, which is where fire control tables come in. But there is a degree of increased battle ranges you can get purely by having the ability to guess the range a little bit more precisely. as well as obviously improving hitting at what had previously been maximum engagement ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 yards. Caius Hulanus asks, I'm curious about the competition and eventual progression of guns from muzzle loaders to breech loaders. What were the things that went wrong with earlier British breech loaders? And what were the engineering challenges between the two? So early on, a muzzle loader was much, much simpler to build, certainly in the era before everything had to be rifled. And therefore, if it was simple to build, it could be fairly easily overbuilt. It was a very safe thing to do, and everyone knew how to load a muzzle loader. Since that had been, well, it hadn't been in the standard go-to entirely since the advent of cannon. Some of the very earliest cannon were, in fact, breech loaders, but for the vast, vast, vast majority of the era of cannons, most cannon had been muzzle loading. Now, the problem for muzzle loaders was, as technology progressed, the gun barrels were getting longer, albeit not quite as long as they would be at the end of the 19th century, but they were getting somewhat longer. The guns were also getting bigger, which meant even if proportionally by calibre the gun barrels weren't getting that much longer, they were physically getting a lot longer, which made loading them a lot more difficult, not just because you had to run the gun further back into the ship, but also because you also then had to have a rammer that was even longer than the interior length of the gun barrel in order to, ram the shell home. And of course, ramming the shells home got harder and harder because the things were getting bigger and bigger. So in the Royal Navy, at one point, you ended up having massive muzzle-loading 12-inch guns where and bigger than that as well, the 100-ton gun, for example, where you had to have this entire complex hydraulic loading system, which, when deployed onto ships, meant you had to have all of these things built into the deck ahead of where you had the guns in place, and then you had the footprint of your gun and its loading systems was massive compared to what we would think of in the 20th century, where the loading all takes place behind the gun and therefore can be a little bit more compact. And of course, once rifling came into play, if you're muzzle loading a gun, then you have to engage the driving band at the mouth of the gun and drive the whole thing down, all the way down to the base of the gun, and then it comes back out the same way it came, which requires even more energy, which is why once you got muzzle loading rifled guns, you went over very quickly in naval terms from manual reloading to hydraulic rams, because that was the only thing that had the energy to push the shell all the way down. Now, when you're looking at the breech loader, this solves a lot of the problems. The breech, obviously, even with a heavy shell, you don't have to push the shell too far in, so the rammer can be a lot shorter and it's directly behind the gun, which works a lot better with turrets. You also don't have to worry about the gun running really far back into the ship, so your recoil systems can have a shorter run, and you're not upsetting the balance of the ship quite as much. And when you've got centre-mounted turrets, that can be a fairly significant issue. You also have the ability, in theory, to fire more quickly, because obviously, if the gun just runs back, open the breech, stick a new shell in, close the breech, and goes back out again, that's an entirely different process and a much swifter process to having to manoeuvre everything to the mouth of the gun and shove everything down the full length of the barrel, apart from all the other issues we just described. And also, if you were loading the gun, as HMS Thunderer would later find out, with a breech loader, it's really, really difficult to double load the thing. I mean, in theory it's possible, but with a breech loader you can simply just look up the barrel to check if you've already loaded it, and if you've done it properly, you open the breech while the charge should be right in front of you, so it's fairly obvious that you have already loaded it, whereas with a muzzle loader, you stuff everything down in there, and unless you've got a light and a very brave person who wants to stick their face into the muzzle of the gun, you are relying purely on memory to recall whether or not you actually loaded the thing. So, with all those obvious advantages, why did the British take so long to go over to breech loaders? Well, they did and they didn't. They were actually very early adopters of breech loaders, as you can see with this one on HMS Warrior. But one of the fundamental issues with breech loaders is how do you ensure a good, safe gas seal? Because obviously with a muzzle loader, It's just a tube which only has one entrance and exit, so you don't have to worry about the gas seal too much as long as the shot and any initially wadding, later on the cartridge, etc., as long as the shot is providing enough of a gas seal in and of itself, you light the propellant and off goes the shell. With the breech loader, the first thing that explosion is going to try and do is blow the breech out. So you have to have the breech able to secure very strongly and very tightly, otherwise you'll get lots of hot propellant gases venting back at you as well. And how you do that was not an insurmountable problem for 1860s technology. The complication was that in order to do that, you would also end up fastening this thing so tight it would be very difficult and very prolonged process to actually get it open again. And so the quest began for a way to have a good, tight, gas-tight and strong seal on the breech, but also have the breech able to be opened and closed relatively quickly without making it too heavy, without making it overly complicated. And Armstrong, with a 110-pounder and related guns, thought they'd solved the problem, which is why Warrior was redesigned, well, not redesigned, but re-equipped, mostly partway through construction, to have 110-pounders as well as 64-pound muzzle loading guns. The problem was Armstrong hadn't solved this problem. There were problems with breech failures, there were problems with gas seals, and all of that led to problems with accuracy, and the Armstrong 110-pounder, as initially installed, was basically a complete failure. This put the British off breech loaders for a while, because they basically looked at them and went, well, clearly these problems aren't actually solved. And they went back to muzzle loaders. And some of the advantages of muzzle loaders I talked about, simplicity, cost, safety, etc., they then embedded themselves in the mind of Royal Navy procurement officers, to the point that even after Armstrong and other nations had solved the breech loading problems, and to be fair, the French had working breech loaders, as in properly working breech loaders, considerably faster than British manufacturers did. But even though the technology was there with the French, and by the mid to late 1860s, the British manufacturers had also solved it, and you can see that in some of the guns they exported to other nations, the Admiralty was, once bitten, twice shy, and it took thunder as double loading explosion in the 1870s to persuade them that maybe, just maybe, you should start switching over to the admittedly slightly more complex, slightly more expensive breech loaders, but just considerably more capable weapons. Matthew Kelly asks, could the Cerberus and the rest of the Royal Victorian Navy Squadron and Fort Nepean have successfully done their job and defended Port Phillip Bay from a Russian squadron? Well, Cerberus was around for quite a while, so what constitutes a Russian squadron in, say, the early 1870s, when she's first in service, versus what constitutes a Russian squadron 20 years later is another matter. But for the heyday of the period she was designed for, i.e. from when she entered service in, roughly speaking, 1870, through to, let's say, the mid-1880s, she probably stands a pretty good chance, actually, because the Russian Navy doesn't actually have that many armoured warships in this period. They've built a few, but they are distributed across the globe, most of them obviously concentrating in the Baltic and the Black Sea, because that's where most of the tension that Russia's experiencing is at that time. They've got, towards sort of the latter part of that period, they've got the General Admiral class, the first armoured cruisers, but putting a General Admiral up against Cerberus would be an interesting matchup. Cerberus certainly has much superior armour and individually superior firepower, but is somewhat slower and has less guns overall. The flip side to that is that if it's defending the harbour, then some of that mobility advantage for the General Admiral goes away, because Cerberus isn't necessarily looking to destroy it, just keep it from getting into the harbour, which a slower ship is much more capable of doing, as opposed to fighting things out on the high seas. So the majority of the Russian ships you're going to find in the Pacific in the 1870s and early 1880s are going to be either smaller ships or non-protected vessels, at which point Cerberus is basically what the Australian Navy or the Royal Victorian Navy at the time designed her for, an outside context problem for most Russian ships. Obviously, as time goes on and the Russians get their hands on more and more modern cruisers with modern weapons, and battleships and so forth, then Cerberus's value decreases. But at the same time, no one's really going to expect an early 1870s ironclad to be a top-of-the-line ship in the mid-1890s, so that's kind of a by-the-by. So, yeah, I think between Cerberus, the other smaller ships of the Royal Victorian Navy, and the guns of the fort, at the time that Cerberus is kind of in her front-line days, for the amount of and type of ships the Russians could bring to bear in the Southwest Pacific region, she probably could stand off against them relatively successfully. If the gods wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh look, Mead asks, how much does relative gun caliber matter? Say you had 3 gun barrels, each 750 inches long, which is a 50 caliber for a 15-inch gun, but you also had a 14-inch variant and a 16-inch variant. Each shell weight is the same, and they have the same propellant charge. So using 1-inch gradations, I mean, we can discuss the issue, but it's probably not going to be the best comparison, because you're talking about a variation of, at that length, about 3 calibers. It's not precise, but the 14-inch is basically rounded, is a 14-inch 53 caliber at that length, and the 16-inch is a 16-inch 47 caliber at that length, with like 0.1 and a bit decimal places out from there. So you're not going to see quite the same difference as, say, 1645 versus a 1550 or a 1455, for example, but you are going to see some performance differences, particularly between the 16-inch and the 14-inch, because they are separated by kind of 6.5 calibers relative. So at that point, assuming they all have the same propellant charge, you would expect the 14-inch shell to be moving the fastest. By default, normally that would be the case, because in theory the 14-inch shell would also be lighter, so you'd have a lighter projectile being propelled by the same amount of propellant but out of a slightly longer barrel, therefore it's going to go faster. However, in this case, you've specified that the shell also is the same. So same shell weight, same propellant charge, and the only variable is the gun barrel length relative to the caliber of the shell. Now, at that point, there is a bit of an interesting conundrum, because the question then is, how are you achieving each shell being the same weight? Unless you're using differential materials, like you're making one out of, I don't know, tungsten or something. If they're all made out of steel, then the 14-inch shell is going to be longer than the 16-inch shell and the 15-inch shell. So that's going to actually probably affect things a lot more, because you're going to have different aerodynamics from the different length to breadth ratios of the different shells. But if we're just looking at pure muzzle velocity, then the 14-inch should, in theory, still be the one that's moving the fastest, purely because, same propellant charge, same energy, same shell weight, so, force exerted on mass, but with the caliber of the barrel being 14 inches, there is less volume for the gas to expand into, which for the same amount of propellant is going to lead to a higher pressure, at which point the 14-inch shell will go faster than the 15-inch, which will go faster in turn than the 16-inch, albeit that the margin will probably be fairly narrow. Dave Collier asks, could you tell us a bit about Captain Robert Fitzroy of HMS Beagle? Is it true he committed suicide because he felt so guilty at his part in, as he called, releasing the abomination of evolution on the world? So Captain Fitzroy is a rather interesting character. He actually appears to have started life as a fairly competent and possibly destined for high-ranking naval officer, His competency level certainly seems to have been above average. It does help that he had friends in powerful positions. Patronage still not entirely gone in the Royal Navy at this point. But he generally, by his exam results and his initial successes in command of ships, and obviously in when he's a lieutenant, and a midshipman, they do seem to have justified the sort of little bit of patronage that was brought his way. So kind of an above average officer. Then obviously goes on the Beagle voyage, but then there is a rather large but that's hanging over this all. He does seem to have inherited something of a family disposition to extreme depression, although not that I'm any kind of medical expert, but with the rapidity and severity at which his depressive episodes could come on, I don't think it would strictly be depression as we understand it today. Maybe more like manic depression, or possibly even bipolar disorder. He could literally turn on a dime and just go completely to pieces. Which is something that seems to have been affecting the various men in his family history before him, including Lord Castlereagh, who he was related to. Now, he had multiple interests, and after he was in command of Beagle, which is obviously where he met with Charles Darwin, he went on to become governor of New Zealand, which wasn't going through the best of times. Let's just say the settlers were exploiting the local population, to the Maori, to a relatively severe degree, and Fitzroy suffered the fate of quite a number of colonial governors in the period, in that he actually tried to do the right thing. He tried to help the Maori and force the colonists to live up to the treaties and obligations that they and Britain as a whole had signed with the Maori. And this obviously made the colonists very angry with him, and he wasn't given the financial backing from London that he needed to, have the troops to implement his policies and make sure people obeyed them, and to balance the books of the colony of New Zealand. And inevitably, if he has not a tremendous amount of resources and most people working against him, then eventually has to scale back what he's trying to do, and then everybody's unhappy with him, and basically his term of office ends relatively unsuccessfully with a significant Maori uprising going on, which is not the best of records. Also, his whole career down there had obviously interrupted his naval career, so the eccentric, occasionally slightly mad Royal Navy captain wasn't an unknown thing, but having being viewed in general public as having failed as governor of New Zealand, and B, having put his naval career on hold for so long, his star ascending in the Royal Navy was a little bit diminished. Younger captains who were just as able and perhaps not quite as mentally unstable had moved in to the positions that he otherwise probably would have filled. So he resumed his naval career. He was still having these rather severe mood swings, and then eventually he retired, not too long after he actually came back to the UK, and ended up going in to found the Meteorological Office. So if you've heard of a weather forecast, well, a weather forecast is a term that Fitzroy invented. So he was quite happily off predicting the future with weather, and doing a fairly good job of it against a lot of scepticism from people at the time. Meanwhile, being still on half pay, he was gradually being advanced up the Admiralty list. Obviously, during this time, Origin of the Species was released, and the very religious Fitzroy felt rather aggrieved by the whole thing, since, as you mentioned, to a certain degree, he did feel responsible to a certain amount, since he thought to himself that he was the one who'd let Darwin go wandering around the world and come up with the various arguments that he'd put in his book in the first place. But at the same time, that was 5 years before he would ultimately commit suicide. And, well, given his medical history, and given the fact that he was getting a fair bit of stick for his ongoing work with the Met Office, and a lot of pressure from people who didn't like his work, because even you might think someone who's turning around and able to tell you what the weather is would be welcome in all quarters. Not really, because, as is the case with a huge number of things throughout history, you get the large business owners who really don't actually care about their workers in any way, shape or form. And in this particular case, one of the major people who resisted him were the owners of fishing fleets. The fishermen themselves thought Fitzroy was an absolute hero, because his systems could tell if there was a gale coming, and if there was a gale coming, obviously small fishing ships don't tend to last too long in that kind of weather. And Fitzroy had instituted a system that not only could say when a gale was going to come, but also mandated that once the signal went up that there was a gale incoming, that no fishing fleet would leave harbour. So if you happen to be a fisherman that enjoys seeing the next sunrise, Fitzroy is a complete legend. If you are the owner of a fishing fleet, i.e. you're sitting back at home and happily counting your money, then anybody who turns around and says, no, your fishing fleet can't leave harbour today, is a menace to you. And so you're going to put as much pressure on as you can on him to shut up and go away. People are very short-sighted when it comes to this kind of stuff, regardless of the fact that, a number of your fishing ships might not come back. These people are like, well, I don't care. As long as the majority of them come back, then I'm still making money. And if they're not sailing, they're not making me money. Wonderful people that they are. Anyway, so I think between that pressure and his mental health and various other factors, the decision that he made to end his life in 1865, whilst had the ongoing uproar about the publication of Origin of Species might have contributed to it, I don't think it was the major factor. It may have been one of a number of contributory factors, but I think he had much more pressing concerns on his mind in 1865 at the time. John Graubard asks, why are the Japanese Kongo class sometimes called battleships and sometimes battle cruisers? Basically because the Japanese relabeled them in the late 1930s, and that's kind of stuck. And to be fair, also some Western historians have relabeled them battleships as well. Whether or not the Japanese consistently referred to the Congos as battleships or battle cruisers in World War II is actually a matter of some small debate, as I have seen documents, at least in terms of signal interceptions from the Japanese, and some period Japanese documents that have been translated that refer to the Congos sometimes as battle cruisers and sometimes as battleships, albeit obviously signal intercepts and translated Japanese works are subject to the bias of the translator. So without the ability to read Japanese myself, whether or not the Japanese documents do actually have this dichotomy of labelling, or whether it's just people going, oh, it's a Kongo, therefore I will call it this, I don't know. So, but I have seen some discussion about the subject. Anyway, when they were first built, they were definitely battle cruisers. Then in the 1930s, when they had their full modernizations, this is when at least some people will start calling them battleships. I personally disagree with this. Now, the main argument for calling them battleships post-refit is that the Japanese basically ostensibly call them battleships and put them more into a battle line role, which is notionally the realm of the battleship, and therefore they should be fast battleships. As I said, I'm not actually in favour of that at all, for a couple of reasons. Well, quite a few reasons. One, the battle cruiser originally derives from the armoured cruiser. The armoured cruiser was always a secondary battle line support unit. Emphasis on the secondary, not a primary battle line unit. The Germans, of course, designed their battle cruisers explicitly with the idea of sitting full-fledged in the battle line. The British, even with their later battle cruisers, were still looking at them as secondary in the battle line, not kind of just sitting there right alongside the battleships. Then you have Hood, which, as I've discussed in a separate video, personally, although it was called a battle cruiser at the time, I think probably actually edges just into fast battleship territory. But then with the Congos, they're starting as battle cruisers, and then after changes, people are saying, oh, well, maybe we should call them battleships. And then I look at it and go, okay, well, what is it that generally defines the difference between a battle cruiser and a battleship? Outside of role, which, as we just covered, different nations can use both their battleships and their battle cruisers for different roles, and each nation has its own definition of what a battle cruiser is. But in broader terms, a rule of thumb is that battle cruisers usually are faster, slightly less well protected, and slightly less heavily armed than contemporary battleships of the same nation. And that kind of holds true with the Congos. They're not as well protected as the Fusas and the Isays. They do carry the same calibre of gun, but they carry 4 less of them, and they're faster. Now, what happens in their refits? Do they get increased calibre of main battery, or do they get more main battery guns? No. They keep their 8 14-inch guns. Now, 8 14-inch guns is not necessarily excluding them from the Battleship Club. I count Strasbourg as a small battleship, and it has 8 13-inch guns. But let's face it, in the latter part of the 1930s, when the Congos are coming back into service after their modernizations, the only 14-inch armed new build battleship is the King George V, and they have 10 14-inch guns, and they're actually designed to have 12, but they had to cut down the design in the process. Everybody else is building 15 and 16-inch gunships. So without an increase in either barrel count or calibre, I don't think you can justify suddenly changing the designation of the Congos on the basis of its armament. Then you've got speed. Well, what happens? They get faster. That's not the hallmark of a battleship. In fact, the speed increase keeps them in line with later battle cruisers. So Renown, Repulse and Hood are the other battle cruisers left in service in the major navies. Obviously, ex-Goeben is floating around with the Ottomans. But the Congo's speed upgrade means that they can keep pace with, as I said, Renown, Repulse, Hood and arguably Dunkerque, which I personally classify as a battle cruiser. So, speed-wise, well, they were battle cruiser speed for World War I, now they're battle cruiser speed for World War II. And then protection. Well, is their protection upgraded? A little bit. Is it substantially upgraded in terms of additional belt armour to withstand contemporary battleship shells? Because one of the defining features of most battleships is they have to have armour that protects them against at least their own guns, and ideally the guns of everybody who's shooting at them. No, the Congo's belt armour is not upgraded. Well, depending on the source, either not upgraded at all, or if it's given any upgrade in any way, shape or form, it's certainly not increased in thickness to make it credible against even another 14-inch gun, even its own 14-inch guns. So, yeah, they get a little bit more depth protection, they get a bit more anti-aircraft firepower, but that's not going to save them if they end up in a straight-up fight with a battleship at any range. So, yeah, speed, protection, firepower, there's nothing, as far as I can see, that shifted them into the category of battleship. If you put a Congo up against any other battleship that's serving in the major navies, would they win? Well, their speed would mean they could run away. But if they get in a knockdown stand-up fight, assuming that fire control systems, etc., are of similar contemporary levels, well, against the Fusas and the Isays, they're better protected and have more guns. The Nagatos have bigger guns and better protection. Let's not even go into the Yamatos. The US standards all have more guns. They're all 14-inch guns, but they either have 10 in the case of the Nevadas or 12 in the case of everybody else except the Colorados, who have 16-inch guns, so they're bigger guns. All the US standards are better protected. Yes, they're slower, but that's the difference between a battlecruiser and a battleship. And then you look at the British. Well, what do the British bring to the table? They have the Revenge class and the Queen Elizabeths. Yes, they're slower, but again, battleship versus battlecruiser, they're significantly better protected. And yes, they have 8 guns, but they're 8 15-inch guns, so they hit harder. So, yeah, Congo's not going to win against them. Win against the Nelsons? Yeah, no, not going to happen. And then you take the latter generation of Allied battleships, North Carolinas, South Dakotas, King George V's. You know, would a Kongo win a straight-up gunfight with any of those? No. And yes, of course, Kirishima technically fought Washington, although we can forgive Kirishima for that particular loss. Point-blank ambush by Washington. I don't think there's much that would have survived that anyway. And then again, the Iowas, it's not even worth considering. So, you know, Kirishima and Hiei, Kongo, Haruna, they're not going to stand up against any other sort of big three battleship of the time, or even after their upgrades. The best they can do is run away. And against some of them, they can't even do that. And Kongo's not going to beat Bismarck. It's not going to beat Richelieu. It might be able to beat Dunkirk, maybe. But, you know, Dunkirk is, as I said, a battle cruiser in my estimation. If it was Strasbourg versus Kongo, I'd put my money on Strasbourg. Scharnhorsts, I'd probably put my money on the Scharnhorst quite comfortably. So I can't see, in terms of actual straight-up combat value, how one can justify calling the Kongos fast battleships or battleships. They just aren't. They have the characteristics of battle cruisers. They have the endurance against battleship opposition of battle cruisers. If you happen to use a battle cruiser as a battleship, that doesn't mean it's a battleship. It means you're using it wrong. I'll just ask Admiral Beatty about that. Sapper Ninja asks, how do you rate the King George V's armament of 10 14-inch guns against the other treaty-compliant-ish battleships of the same era? Using the scores from your Guns of World War II video and multiplying by the number of barrels gives us the following results. The Dunkirks get 38.4, the Scharnhorst 38.7, Bismarck 42.4, Littorio 43.2, Richelieu 44, King George V 49, and South Dakota, North Carolina 49.5. This places the King George V's armament as almost the best battleship armament ever made. Is this fair, and do you believe this is a fair method to compare the armaments? If not, why not? So just a quick note before I continue, which is that I did publish an updated video where I corrected one value, because in the original video I used absolute maximum range, and various people pointed out that that's possibly not necessarily the most useful factor, because, well, whether you can shoot 40,000 or 48,000 yards really doesn't make much difference. You're not hitting anything at that range. So I changed the range denominator to range at 20 degrees elevation, which is an elevation that all the guns could reach, and you know, it gives a relative value idea of how far they can reach at that elevation, which is a useful point of comparison. That changed the values a little bit, but running the numbers on those, fundamentally you still have the same issue that you point out, which is that the KGVs come either at or very near the top of the pile. Now, in this sense, I don't think it's an entirely fair comparison to make, purely because, as you point out, you know, we're looking at battleships with different numbers of guns, and the comparison that I was constructing was on a gun-for-gun basis, i.e. you compare this gun with that gun, or you compare 8 of the same gun with 8 of the same gun, or whatever. And the various things that were being looked at, with things like bursting charge, armor piercing capability, 20,000 yards, rate of fire, etc. All of these were predicated on the idea that we're comparing a gun-for-gun comparison. If you're going to compare the relative values of each gun multiplied by the number of barrels present in each gun, you would have to have a modifier in place rather than just a straight multiplier, because the main advantage of having an additional barrel is an additional chance to hit per full salvo. There are other advantages, but you know, for broad analysis purposes, that's your main one, unless you're talking about, you know, a ship with 6 guns versus a ship with 12 or something like that, which then leads you to the point that, you know, how much do you value that additional chance to hit, and how much is that chance to hit actually worth? Because if you, and this is where you'd end up getting into probably modifiers based on accuracy amongst various other things, because if you were to say look at the Littorio's guns, obviously exactly what causes the inaccuracies that are seen in World War II is still a matter of debate. We've discussed that a few times on the channel. But, if you were to up the Littorio's armament from 9 guns to 10 guns, or you were to drop it from 9 guns to 8 guns, the fact that it struggles, at least in World War II, to hit anything means that change is probably not actually all that significant. Where a 10-gun Littorio versus a 8-gun Iowa, for example, my money's still going to be on the Iowa, because even if you had, I don't know, a twin turret super firing over the foremost turret on the Iowa, and you had a quad on the back of Littorio, chances are at long range the Iowa's probably still going to hit, and that's the important thing. Whereas if you just do an absolute multiplier, then assuming the gun isn't completely and utterly awful, then the one with the more guns is going to immediately come out on top. And if it's relatively close, or even not so close, that extra barrel is going to stack up hugely. So, for example, in the revised values, the 16-inch 45 on the North Carolinas scored 5.1, Richelieu's 15-inch gun scored 5.5, the 14-inch on the King George V scored 4.7, so this is all out of 10, so there's a relative gap, but simply by the fact that there's an entire extra gun in there, multiplying by 8, 9 or 10 respectively, you end up with the King George V coming out ahead. Richelieu 5.5 by 8 is 43.9, North Carolina, South Dakota 5.1 by 9 is 45.5, and then King George V 4.7 by 10 is 47. So, yeah, I don't think it is entirely correct to take the scores and then simply multiply them by barrel count. There has to be, if you're going, taking it a step further and using the barrel count as part of the analysis is a valid thing to do. But I would say if you're going to do that, you have to introduce a further modifier for overall accuracy, i.e., and then that's again not going to be just a simple value. That's going to be, working out what's the accuracy of the gun, therefore what's the accuracy per salvo, how much is the accuracy per salvo going up by introducing another gun, what's the increased chance to hit, and that would then be, I would suggest, the modifier that would affect having the extra guns, and that's probably going to make things a lot closer than simply just going 10 gun, 8 gun, 9 gun. The Freaker 86 asks, I've listened to your video about the Mark 14 several times, but besides Admiral Christie being part of the development team of the Exploder, it doesn't, at least for me, not completely explain the astonishingly stubborn and prolonged denial of reality of the Bureau of Ordnance. Why did they act like this? So in a recent Drydock I answered a similar question, and yes, there's a culture of denialism going on in BuOrd about its failures, and to dive a little bit deeper into that, I think there's a number of different factors. Firstly, there's the fact that BuOrd is staffed in large part by serving US Navy officers who are cycling through their careers and then going back out into operational commands like Admiral Christie. So that means that there are people within the US Navy who are fairly highly placed, who are very invested in the success, or at least the on-paper success and capability, of weapon systems that have gone through BuOrd. Their personal reputation and potentially career is on the line if it turns out they supervise something that was completely useless and is costing US servicemen's lives. And it's all too predictable for when things like this show up for those officers to move to protect their careers first and worry about everything else second. Me first, everyone else can go hang, even if those other people happen to be the people who are now, as in the case of some US admirals, under your command and are being actively sent out to sea to fight with a weapon that you developed. That doesn't work. Now, where the line between incompetence and malice is drawn is somewhat nebulous, because it basically comes down to how much do you believe the admiral in question, or the officer in question, may not necessarily be an admiral, how much do you believe that they knew and believed the problem was real? Because, denialism is a form of incompetence, but not necessarily a form of malice. If they're just like, no, I built it, I know it works, it can't possibly be anything wrong with it, then, it's incompetence, and it's selfish, but it's understandable. But then if you know for a fact that it doesn't work, but to save your reputation and your career, you're just going to continue to insist that it does, then it crosses the line into malice. And it's very difficult, in most cases, to work out where that line is and which officers sat on which side of that line. Generally, obviously, you try and be charitable unless there's significant circumstantial evidence otherwise to assume the less egregious of the two. So anyway, so you've got high-ranking officers elsewhere who are now elsewhere in the Navy. You've also got people within the Bureau of Ordnance themselves, people who are still working there, who are made up. I think the problem there is twofold. Partly it's a rear echelon versus front echelon problem. People at the rear echelon can sometimes live in a world full of perfect spherical cows in vacuums where everything works in lab conditions. And so, if the paper says it works, then it works, and everybody else is doing it wrong. And they may not ever think to do practical field tests because, no, the paper says it should work. It's always worked this way. We've calculated it should work this way. Therefore, reality should conform to my will. Reality, of course, just turning around saying, well, actually, no, I don't have to. So, there's that element. And there's also the element of, what's the best way to put it? And this translates somewhat into the officers who have gone back out into the field as well. What I would broadly term peacetime careerism, because in prolonged periods of peace, certainly in navies, there tends to develop this habit of people absolutely denying anything that possibly has ever gone wrong in their career ever, if they can at all cover it up. Because in a long-term peacetime navy, the tiniest of infractions can see you lose your command or have your career completely derailed. And so people absolutely terrified of that will do literally anything to, as far as they can perceive, save their career. And especially if you're in a rear echelon office, you may not appreciate just what effect that career-saving denial is having on people on the front lines. And that's kind of a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, people are being incredibly selfish to the detriment of others. On the other hand, it is kind of the onus is on the navies who keep slipping into this problem as well. You get officers who do things that in previous generations, someone like a Nelson or a Drake or a Sims or a Dewey would have gotten away with, because either it happened after they've got their reputation, or it happens in a period of tension or war when suddenly the Navy's focused more on competence rather than maybe the occasional grounding. But then you have to ask yourself, how many other officers in peacetime who would have been great in wartime got cashiered or had their careers severely held back because they made one small slip up, or maybe there just was a problem that they couldn't have done anything to avoid, but ultimately they were the ones in charge, so the buck stopped with them. I mean, Admiral Nimitz, back when he was multiple ranks lower down the ladder, managed to ground his destroyer. Now, at some points in the Navy, let's say the 1870s Royal Navy, the early 1930s US or British Navy, most navies these days, you ground your ship, even if it's a small one, and that's it. Command career is basically over. Yeah, imagine what the state the US Navy would have been in World War II if Admiral Nimitz had been either held back or drummed out of the service even before the First World War simply because he had a bit of a brush with a mudbank. But if people are used to this kind of thing, and they absolutely don't want any spot on their record, then they will deny to the high heavens that there should be any spot on their record. And, mix all these factors together, and I think you get the situation at BuOrd. Although, again, as I mentioned in the most recent US-specific submarine campaign video, it's not at all levels of BuOrd, because the head of BuOrd, once Admiral Lockwood was actually able to get through to him in person and say these are the problems, realised that maybe his subordinates weren't feeding him information or weren't feeding him correct, honest information, and began to take steps to try and change things. But the system should have worked with those subordinates, the ones who were taking the calls and the telegrams and the messages from the front line. They should have been doing their jobs properly in the first place, not trying to cover everything up so that they look good in front of their boss. And finally, Matt Blom asks, in discussions about the Dunkerque class, I've noticed you speak about Strasbourg as if it's actually quite distinct from Dunkerque herself. Despite how superficially similar the ships seem, do you think Strasbourg is de facto its own subclass, and what are the key differences between the two ships? So there are minor differences in speed, anti-aircraft firepower, displacement and length between Dunkerque and Strasbourg, but they are not particularly egregious. If you were going to pick apart those as subclass issues, then, well, you'd be classifying practically every capital ship ever constructed as its own one-ship subclass, and the Germans were considerably worse for this. And to be honest, the French in pre-World War I were considerably worse for this. Whereas the tolerances on those items between Dunkerque and Strasbourg are, actually well within the tolerances for things like Iowas or King George V, etc. Now, the reason I tend to split Dunkerque and Strasbourg apart is because, at least in my mind, they straddle the line between battlecruiser and battleship. They're both fast. They're both fast enough to count as battlecruisers if the other, classifications allow for that. And of course, if they're that quick, they're also quick enough to qualify as fast battleships. Their main armament, and they've got 8 guns, so 8 guns kind of entry level for battleships, really. They're 13-inch, okay, they're somewhat small compared to their contemporaries, but the ships themselves are somewhat small as well, and the 13 inches are quite powerful. So it could be a battlecruiser armament, could be a small battleship armament. I mean, there's the Scharnhorst basically are also battleships, albeit lightly armed ones, and they have 11-inch guns. So, 13-inch gun armament, as long as there's a respectable number of barrels, which there are, doesn't rule them out of being either battleships or battlecruisers. So that's your speed, that's your firepower. Well, then you come over to your protection, and protection is where they differ hugely, because Dunkirk was designed to counter the Deutschlands, and then by the time they were building Strasbourg, they were aware suddenly of the Scharnhorst, and she was redesigned to take care of that. Because remember, not only do the Scharnhorst have 3 additional 11-inch guns, their 11-inch guns are considerably more powerful than the 11-inch guns of the Deutschlands. So when you look at the armour, Dunkirk's belt armour, for example, 8.9 inches, near enough 9 inches. That is armour typical of Lion, Queen Mary, Princess Royal, Tiger, Renown and Repulse as refitted. It's battlecruiser grade protection. And the deck armour, etc., is similarly scaled. But then when you look at Strasbourg now has just over 11 inches of armour. So it's 11.1 versus 8.9, so it's technically 2.2 inches increase, but there's also various changes to armour, deck, etc., which similarly changes the figures for Strasbourg. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that the belt armour on Dunkirk and Strasbourg is inclined. It's not as inclined as some, belts, but it is somewhat inclined. And I think if you look at the Iowas, or indeed the South Dakotas, or the North Carolinas, and you look at it and go, okay, well, 12-inch inclined armour is considered suitable belt armour for a 35 or 45,000 ton battleship. Well, 0.9 of an inch less, also inclined. Okay, again, not necessarily inclined as much, but still inclined enough to be somewhat useful on a ship that is, what, for Strasbourg, 27,000 tons at a stretch standard displacement. That's fairly reasonable protection, I would say. I mean, at longer ranges, you've got some ships that have vertical armour that is less than the equivalent of 11.1 inch armour inclined. So at that point, Strasbourg, I think, sits neatly in terms of speed protection, speed, firepower and protection into the category of small battleship, whereas Dunkerque, it just edges over the line a little bit towards battlecruiser because it's got the inclination, but the overall thickness of the belt is relatively low, so it pushes its protection up past perhaps the various battlecruisers, other battlecruisers that I listed, but not by an awful lot. And that rounds out the video for this week. It ran slightly longer because a couple of the questions took a bit longer to answer than I thought they would, but thank you very much nevertheless for listening. If you haven't seen the video I put up as a Fun Friday just recently, well, you're under no obligation to it. It is a little bit different from normal, but it is a kind of half AMA, half naval questionnaire to the accompaniment of me and my cameraman gradually succumbing to the effects of hot sauces. So if you think that would be amusing and you haven't seen it already, go and have a look. If that doesn't interest you at all, then perfectly fine as well. I kind of will take guidance on how well it performs overall as to how much interest there is in that kind of thing, generally as a Fun Friday. But in any case, regardless of all of that, thank you for listening. Channel admin time. Hope you've enjoyed part 3.1, if you like, of the Battle of Trafalgar, the Life of Admiral Nelson, which released earlier this week. There is just one final part remaining, which is going to be, obviously, the battle itself, 3.2. Originally, it was all going to be one thing, but as you can probably tell from the length of that one, by the time I got to the start of the battle, I was thinking, yeah, okay, this needs to be a two-parter. And who knows, maybe it'll even be a three-parter. Maybe if in the new year, if the Battle of Trafalgar video itself does quite well, I might go and hunt down a couple of rather interesting historians that I've wanted to talk to for a while, and we can have a roundtable discussion on the legacy of Nelson, so what he accomplished after his death. But again, that's all for the future. Other than that, thank you very much for listening, and see you again in another video.